Today, we are going to review AWS Solutions Architect Associate sample questions and discuss the answers. This discussion is from our study group. Listen in, and I'm sure you'll be wondering how it is possible to learn so much from just 10 questions. So today we are going to focus on these sample questions. Let's review one question at a time, and then I want you all to chip in your answers in the chat window. Pick what you think is the correct answer, and then we can discuss the solution. All right, let's get started with the first question, which is essentially a CRM application running on EC2 instances in multiple AZs behind an application load balancer. So the question is asking if one of these instances fail, what will happen? Right? So what do you think will happen among these four choices? A lot of you have picked A. Can somebody explain why A?
So, Chandra, Nitish here. So,
Sure.
the load balancer will never replace any failed instance. It will just stop sending the traffic to a failed instance.
Okay.
That's why A is correct.
A is correct. Okay, that's perfect. And what will happen if the instance becomes healthy again?
So, yes, it will be part of the group, the target group. So, once it becomes healthy, the load balancer will send a check to the instance first, and then if it is found healthy, it will start sending traffic.
Perfect answer. Yep, that is what is going to happen. How does load balancer know whether instance is healthy or not?
So it has a mechanism. You can configure that mechanism that every time interval, and the load balancer can send a ping request or the 80 port request,
okay.
And through this it will check.
Perfect. Thank you, Nitish. So yeah, when you set up a load balancer, you have to configure a health check, and by default, it automatically monitors the health of EC2 instance itself, meaning if the instance itself is stopped or shut down or terminated, then load balancer will know right away. But instance up and running and your application is up and running is two different things, right?
Yeah.
So your instance might be healthy, but your application may not be healthy. There might be some application issue. To handle that scenario, we have to configure a health check at the load balancer. And then that health check you can customize. You can say, visit this particular page in the website, and then load balancer will do the check. Every 30 seconds, you can configure it. Every 30 seconds or so, it'll send a request and check if it's getting a valid response. And so forth. If it doesn't, then if it gets 2 or 3 successive failures, once again, that is configurable. What is your tolerance level? So usually like 2 or 3 successive calls failed, then the instance will be marked as unhealthy, but it will be still part of load balancer. Load balancer will keep checking the health continuously, even though if it's failed. So if it becomes healthy again, so if it was a transient issue, some temporary issue, and then the instance became healthy again, then load balancer will start sending the requests to the instance. This is a common point of confusion, right? See, people often think C is also something load balancer does. Which service specifically handles this? If you have to replace failed instance, what do you need to use?
Autoscaling.
Yep, autoscaling. Perfect. So load balancer alone will not replace instances. So if you want to maintain capacity or adjust capacity, then we have to also configure autoscaling. That's perfect. Anything else? Anybody want to add anything else to it? To what we are discussing? Okay. So what will happen if all instances failed?
Nothing. It won't send any request. Maybe it will return 404 kind of thing.
So what? Interestingly, what AWS documentation? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to talk from my memory. I think AWS documentation says if all instance fails, then it doesn't care. It will keep sending requests to one of these instances, and it'll and eventually the caller will get a error back. saying that the instance, whatever error the instance is responding back, that's the same error the caller will also see.
In that scenario, who will set the response? Because the application anyway will not respond, right?
Application, I mean, the browser, the web server will give a 404 or 500 error.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah, it'll be a 500 error, right? So some 500 series error.
So that is why that's why the best practice says the load balancer should be always backed by auto scaling group, right? That's the best practice.
Yeah, I mean, that is the best practice, but it can happen that there is an application bug or something. So that leads us to the second question, right? So one other question I have. So the ALB, you can configure health check, right? Any load balancer, you can configure health check and it will call your application and does a health check. Now, how detailed should this health check be? Let's say you're having a 3-tier application. So how detailed can this health check be?
Yeah, you can check it.
Ideally, it should not be very deep. I mean, it should be very non-invasive kind of check. Just to make sure that application is up and running.
Okay, why do you say that?
Because if it is deep, you can get into more troubles. I mean, if you don't know where you have to demarcate what is a real health check or what other things it is trying to achieve.
Okay.
So looking for a database checkup and all, it might take time.
Okay. I think your answer is very good and that's very correct. But can somebody think of a reason why deep check?
No, it will take the network bandwidth actually, because health checks in the public internet, right?
No, health check is in private, right? So load balancer
Private.
is calling your application. Yeah, it's private. So assume that bandwidth is not the issue.
Okay. Because I thought even in the case of Route 53, I remember various other servers hit the this one and perform the health, hit the servers.
Correct. Route 53 does a distributed health check. It's not just your load balancer. It will come from a global network of servers. There, it can potentially cause issues. So if you configure very aggressive health check in Route 53, you will get too many requests at your server to do health check.
Yeah, basic level of checking, like how basic, what kind of basic, you just ping it and see whether the server is up and running, the instance up and running. Like, what is a basic check you normally do?
Okay, so when I started learning AWS, I was thinking that I should do deep check because I want to make sure all the tiers of my application is up and running. Right, that's what I was thinking. AWS threw in a wrench and saying that, okay, so what if your database is failing over? Database failover can happen, right? During a maintenance event or some unusual event happen and database is failing over. And it's a transient issue. It may take a couple of minutes and then system will be up and running. Now, if you start doing health check, deep health check, let's say you're going all the way to the database, then all your servers will start failing health check, right? And then what will autoscaling do in this case if your health check fails?
Oh, it will spin off new instances.
It will keep on adding.
It's going to terminate all the instances and keep adding new instances. So it will keep cycling through that. And so that's why if you're just using ALB and doing deep health check, it's not an issue because it's containing at some level. But if autoscaling is involved, then all of a sudden you'll run into a scenario where the autoscaling is going to interfere and going to terminate all these unhealthy instances and launch. So it'll keep terminating and launching new instances. So it'll be, the entire environment will become unstable now. So that is one reason why AWS is saying that you should not do deep health checks. Rather, do some simple checks to quickly check if your web components are installed or working properly. I don't know what is the definition of simple check is. What should be sufficient level of check to guarantee something is working correctly?
Some 200 OK should be enough, I guess.
Well, that is the error response, right? But what logic will you have in that page?
Okay.
Let's say
So-
if I have a Nginx web server running, right? I will probably do a like, okay, whether the service is running on the instance or not. That is a very simple check I check.
Yeah.
If web service is not running, obviously your web page is not going to work. So that is one of the simple checks I normally do. So
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I guess that's a good strategy. So something like that you may want to do if your application components are working at the server level, and that limit at that level. Don't go too deep. All right. Any other questions on this first question itself?
So, Chandra, from my side, what my thought process is, we should do only one level check, and other level check like app server or DB level check should be done in the first level only. If there are any failures, we should give the proper response. So that's what we usually do.
Okay, that sounds like a good strategy actually, because even app layer will have your own load balancer, right? App load balancer. There you can check at the app level, and there maybe you can go. You can do similar logic there, right? I'm assuming if you're having an app tier, you also have one more load balancer sitting in front of the app tier, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Good discussion, and let's move on to the next one. Company needs to perform asynchronous processing as an SQS queue as part of decoupled architecture. The company wants to ensure the number of empty responses from polling requests are kept to a minimum. So what should we do if you want to reduce the empty responses in an SQS queue? Among 4 choices, which one is the correct answer? Throw the answer in the chat window and then we'll discuss. All right, so this is asking about the SQS queue. So if you are familiar with the messaging system and SQS queue, this answer is easy to, this question is easy to answer. However, if you're not familiar, then it can be quite confusing. So a lot of you answered C. Unfortunately, C is not the correct answer. And D is the correct answer. D is in Delta. So, Nitesh, I think you're the only one who answered it correct. Yeah. Can you explain why D is the correct answer?
Sure. So when a system or instance which is going to pull the messages from the queue, it goes and picks the message and come back to the response, come back to instance. But if there are no messages, it will come empty-handed. So there is a parameter called receive message wait time in seconds. If we keep it as a 0, it will just go and come back. Whether the message is there or not, it will go and come back. So that's why it will happen. It will happen like more empty responses are coming. But if we are keeping it greater than 0, this parameter, it will go and wait for that much of time and then come back with whatever message is available. So that's how this parameter works.
Perfect. What is the specific term AWS uses for that? If you set it as 0, any thoughts?
Yeah, long polling queue and short polling queue.
Okay, perfect. Receive message. Let's look at the SQS receive message API. It's used for decoupling systems, right? Everybody stands in a line in a grocery store, and then so if there is a sudden burst in number of people trying to check out, and if there are too many people waiting, you can open up more checkout lanes, right? You can scale your infrastructure up to open up more checkout lanes, and people can check out in parallel. So similar concept, and so that's what queue is used for. However, the way queue works is that the producer will publish messages to the queue, and the consumer of the messages have to keep polling the queue for messages. So it operates on the principle of polling. And by polling, that means the consumer of the message is responsible for checking the queue to see if there is a message or not. Now, if there is always some message sitting there, then consumer will always get some message back. But if there are no messages in the queue, you have 10 instances of consumer running, all of them will frequently poll and get a lot of empty responses. The empty response is bad because you're using a lot of back and forth traffic, and there is also an aspect of billing, which is tied to number of requests you make. SQS charges are also tied to number of requests you make. The behavior that we described now is called short polling, where we're checking if the message is not there, we are immediately getting a response back. We may have a loop, infinite loop, Immediately it'll call again and then get an empty response back. So which is not very efficient, right? So instead, what you can do is, so there is a wait time parameter. When you specify a wait time parameter, so it can be between 0 and 20 seconds. So if you specify, let's say 20 seconds, then the call is going to wait until 20 seconds or when the message is available. So one of these conditions have to be met. So let's say it started waiting. At 5th second, the message arrived. Then what will happen is it will immediately grab the message and return it to you. If there is no message, then it's going to wait for 20 seconds and then it'll return an empty response. So this is called, AWS calls this as long polling, L-O-N-G, long polling. AWS recommends that you always use long polling and preferably, and to minimize cost, reduce the cost, and eliminate the number of empty responses. And there is also, you can also eliminate false empty responses. Does anybody know what false empty response means?
No
Okay.
message, and that no message condition is the false thing. But the question is why it is a default behavior for a short poll, and if it is inefficient, why it is the default behavior
Okay.
rather than
So,
a long poll?
okay, that's also a good question. So let's first discuss false empty response, and then I'll come back to that. So false empty response is something that is that you can observe in a lot of distributed systems. This is talking about a scenario where SQSQ indeed has a message, but a caller is getting an empty response. Okay, sounds contradictory, right? Confusing. SQSQ has a message, but caller is getting an empty response. This can happen in a distributed system like SQSQ, and which has only few messages, like 3 or 4 messages. But second time when the caller makes a call, they will get a response back with a message. Because to optimize for performance, what they do is they poll a sample of servers. SQSQ might have, behind the scenes, may have hundreds of servers. Instead of pinging every server, they'll just sample 1 or 2 servers, or maybe 3 or 4, and then see if there is a message and respond back. Those servers may not have the message. So that's why it can get a false empty response. So the caller will keep calling, and eventually they'll get the message back. Now, long polling, on the other hand, eliminates false empty responses. When you specify a wait time of greater than 0, it could be 5 or 6 or 2 or 3, whatever the number is, you won't see any false empty responses because it's going to query all the available servers and then respond back. Now, as far as the question on why they have not made it default, I'm not sure. I mean, you can specify this wait time when you create a queue, or the caller can specify the wait time. I guess this is one of the shared responsibility aspect. AWS provides certain features, and from shared responsibility perspective, it is our responsibility to take advantage of certain things.
Rather than polling like every 20 seconds or something like that, like, is there any way we can actually create a trigger? Okay, can we do something like that?
So in that case, if you want a trigger push notification, then you have to use SNS instead of SQS.
Okay.
So the publisher would simply publish the message to SNS topic, and then it'll automatically call the consumer. That's called push notification. Here, the queue supports only polling. Okay.
Polling means
So,
pull it, right? Yeah.
Pull. The caller has to go and pull it.
So another question is there any scenario like where the default behavior works, and for some scenarios we need to tweak the parameter for a larger than 0 value? I mean, so just to understand it.
I think I talk about specific scenario in the course. So the only scenario is where you don't want to use long polling is that you have a single threaded application.
Okay.
Single threaded application that is processing multiple queues. So there is a lot of, I don't know where this scenario will happen, but in case if you come across a single threaded application that checks, like say 2 different queues and message something like a priority queue. You have 2 queues based on priority, one low and high priority. And then the application itself is single-threaded, and there is only one instance of application running. And that is the only scenario where short polling will make sense.
Okay.
For everywhere else, long polling should be the default. I mean, if a message is there, you will get the message right away. If the message is not there, only then the long polling timeout will, the wait time will kick in. Okay, so the third question is, so the company is currently storing data for on-premises applications on local drives. The CTO wants to reduce hardware costs by storing data in S3, but does not want to make a modification to the applications. To minimize latency, frequently accessed data should be available locally. What is a reliable and durable solution for solution architect to implement that will reduce the cost of local storage? So here, CTO wants to reduce the hardware costs on premises. Well, put your choice in the chat window, and then we'll discuss. All right, who wants to explain the answer? Why B?
So latency should be low, so it has to be cached to the storage gateway. Otherwise, there has to be a network trip to S3 to get the data.
In the cache volume mode, I think the primary storage is S3. So that is what gone through, right? That's what I understand also. And then the frequently accessed pages alone will be in our files, whatever files or volumes, right? Will be there in the on-premise.
Okay, perfect. So that's exactly right. Primary storage in this case is S3, and only cache is maintained locally. So first of all, why storage gateway?
They need not to change the application, modify the applications if they use storage gateway.
Okay. So the requirement, that is important, right? So the main requirement here is that none of the application needs to be modified to use cloud, right? So they should not even be aware that they are using cloud. Rather, it should be, transparent to the application. And for that reason, storage gateway makes sense, because storage gateway can present S3 as a file share or a volume share or a tape device, right? 3 different modes. Anybody want to talk about stored volume mode on storage gateway?
Entire storage will be in on-premise, and copy there in S3 and frequent asynchronously to synced up. So that way, I think that is what it is. The difference between DL.
Yep, that's exactly correct. So storage gateway, if you configure it as a stored volume mode, then what it's going to do is it's going to keep all your data on premises, and then it's going to make an asynchronous copy to cloud S3. So the main reason why you want to do this versus this is that the cached is going to cache only frequently accessed data. Access any other data that is not in the cache, there will be an increased latency, right? Because it has to fetch the data from the cloud. So there will be some increased latency in this case. Whereas here, you'll always get highest performance because all the data is locally there. And then there is a backup that is maintained automatically in the cloud. So some customers who want to maintain automatic backup in the cloud, they want all the data to be available locally at as quickly as possible, or rather minimum latency, then this option makes sense. But there is also,
Fourth option will not satisfy the requirement of reducing the hardware cost, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Because that is exactly right. So that's why we cannot put the fourth option, because it'll increase the footprint on the on-premises. And another reason why this could be useful is that this option, so what will happen, so if you go with this option, what will happen if your internet connection network connectivity to cloud is disrupted, right? So that can happen, right? So and then this whole volume may become unaccessible now or inaccessible. Whereas here, you won't suffer that problem. Even if network is down, the cloud connection, internal network is up and running, but the backend connection to the cloud is down, you can still access your data. Okay. So that is why we pick B in this scenario, because we want to minimize the footprint. All right, let's move to the fourth one. So we have a 3-tier public-facing application in a VPC across multiple AZs. EC2 instances for the application tier are running in private subnets. They need to download a software patch from the internet. Instances cannot be directly accessible from the internet. You all know which one is one of the answers, but they're asking for picking 2 choices here. Which 2 are the correct choices? And put your answers in the chat window, please. Can somebody talk through what is the significance of deploying a NAT device and why should it be in public sector?
So NAT gateway is the only device that will be exposed to the internet. So that's where we are keeping it in the public subnet, so that rest of the the private the servers on the private subnet, etc., which will have the route in the route table to NAT gateway, will be hidden. So that's the whole intent of NAT gateway, that keeping it. So that's where we are keeping the NAT gateway in the public subnet as well, so that it is internet facing.
And also NAT gateway is only one way from instance to internet, not other way around, right?
So if you want to allow a private instance to talk to the internet, then we need a NAT device, NAT gateway or NAT instance. And then the app server, the private instance, will make a request, outbound request to the internet, and it will be routed to the NAT. NAT will make a request on the behalf of the private instance to the internet, collect the response, and then the response will be forwarded back to the private instance. Now, for this to happen, first thing is we need to have a NAT in the public subnet, because public subnet is the only subnet that is attached to the internet, right? Because it has a path to the internet gateway. So we need to have the NAT in the public subnet. And then the route table for the private subnet, by default, it will have only the local route. It will allow only local traffic. Now we have to modify that route table to allow non-local traffic. So in this case, any other traffic other than local, it will be forwarded to the NAT gateway. The private instances are not even aware of NAT, right? It is the routing table. The route table is automatically routing the request to NAT and then forwarding the response back to the caller. So that is why we need to configure both. We need to have a NAT gateway in the public subnet, and then we need to define a custom route table with a route to the NAT gateway for internet traffic, and we have to attach it to the private subnet. All right, so let's move on to the next one. So the fifth question is, a solution architect wants to design a solution to save costs for EC2 instances that do not need to run during a 2-week company shutdown. Okay, so there's a 2-week company shutdown, typically happens in December in the US, right? Sometimes they will shut down during the holidays. And application running on the instances store data and RAM. So they want to preserve the content of the RAM and resume from that. So what option should the solution architect recommend? Okay, would somebody want to explain the answer for this one? What would you do?
So when the instances are enabled on the hibernation, when we shut down, it goes to first hibernate state, where it takes the backup of the data what is stored on the instance store. The only condition is it should be EBS backed, and when it requires to be resumed, it will read from that EBS, and then the instance will be up and running.
So when you shut down, it's going to stop all the running applications. So that is a shutdown behavior. When you restart it, the instance will be up and running, but you have to restart the application and so forth. So let's say application is doing a video conversion, doing a long running job, and it completed 50% of the work. Now we want to preserve it, and then when the machine comes back online, it has to continue from that. The application has to continue running from where it left off. Here, you have to lean towards hibernation. Now, hibernation is a capability which will preserve the memory state and restore it back.
Also, not all instance types support hibernation, right, Chandra? Am I right or?
Correct. I think that's my understanding too. Not everything supports hibernation. All right, let's move on to the sixth question. So, company plans to run a monitoring application on an EC2 instance in a VPC. connections are made to the instance using its private IP address. SA needs to design a solution that will allow traffic to be quickly directed to a standby instance if the application fails and becomes unreachable. So all communication is happening through private IP address, and there is a monitoring going on. And we need to redirect the traffic to a standby instance if the primary instance fails. So what solution would you use in this case? Please put the answer in the chat window. Okay, so let's discuss the answers. So a lot of you are picked C, and I see some A and some C as well. DHCP, you don't have control over how private IP addresses are assigned. So that's not an option. So DHCP we can rule out. So among these three choices, which one would you use? So somebody picked D. Why would D? Why did you pick D? So this solution will technically work if you want to migrate a public endpoint to a standby instance, right? So this is a well-known best practice for moving a public endpoint from one server to another server. So on its own, the statement is correct, but it's not correct for this question.
Just because it is private.
That's because the question is talking about migrating a private IP address.
Okay.
Right. So for this reason, we can go with this option. Right. So we can attach a secondary Elastic interface to the instance and configure with the private IP. And then when the primary goes down, you can just detach the Elastic interface and attach it to the second instance.
That can be automated, right?
That can be automated. Yes, it can be automated. Now, here's a question. So will this solution work? Let's say if they decide to do it this way, will this even work? Any thoughts?
It's a manual thing. It's a manual, right? So we need to deregister. And
is this solution feasible, technically feasible? I know it's manual, but will this approach even work?
At a face value, it works.
Okay.
But it's a tedious process.
Only load balancer, you can configure and register a private IP address. And then if it fails, then you can deregister and add the second instance. Technically, it should work, but it's too much work, actually. Instead, a better option is you go with this one. We have to evaluate all the choices and then pick one that is relevant for this question. So this is actually a good question, fairly in-depth, with multiple correct answers on its own.
So what about security groups? That will also come along with this, attached to that. If you have any security groups attached to that that interface, if that fails, like you're attaching another interface, right? So security groups will also go along with it.
That's an excellent question. So we have to think through that, right? So when you're designing a solution like this, so security group is by default attached to a network interface, not to the instance. Even though we call it as attached to the instance, by default, when you attach it to an instance, it's automatically attached to the primary network interface. And in this example, in this scenario, you have to make sure you attach the security group to the secondary network interface, so that when it moves over to the next instance, another instance, the security group will also move with that interface.
Okay.
Right.
So you don't have to do anything special. Like let's say if you have complicated security groups rules there, so it automatically carry along with it. So
the only thing you have to make sure is that you are attaching the security group not to the instance, but to the network interface, secondary network interface.
Because the same security group should go along with it, because
correct,
same thing, right? So
yeah, that's a good point actually. All right, let's move on to the 7th question. So this one, analytics company is planning to offer a site analytics service to its users. So there's a lot of unneeded information, right? That's what will happen in the question. So they're building some scenario. The service will require that users' web pages include a JavaScript that makes authenticated GET requests to the company's Amazon S3 bucket. What must a solution architect do to ensure that the script will successfully execute? What is the answer for this one? Okay, anybody want to talk through the answer for this one? And a lot of you have picked A and some have picked C.
Yeah, so A option is that cross-origin resource sharing is something like when we try to access from one website to other website using scripts, it needs an authentication or a shake hand between the two websites kind of thing. We need to maintain this access in a cross CORS configuration. That's how it handshakes and try to transfer the data from one side to other side. The other three options like versioning is not important for this. The signed URL, anyways, it's not a timed request or something that they want to authenticate to this. And the last is bucket policies. We can play around always if we want or if we don't want. So that's what the first option best for me.
Okay. So browsers, right? Browsers have built-in sandboxes and security. So if you visit a website, the browser will allow the script to talk only to that website. So to allow a browser and say that it's okay to call the other website, the analytics service is running on a different domain, whereas S3 is running on a different domain. So since there is a cross-origin, cross-domain call, S3 bucket has to be configured to allow such a call. And you can put a wildcard like star, saying that anybody can call, or you can say that only specific domains are allowed to call S3. You can configure it.
I was about to ask whether S3 is implicitly public or something. Okay. In this case.
What do you think?
So that now, if we configure it that way, I mean, some specific domains, path-based access is only enabled on S3, then it need not be.
So browser is calling from somewhere, right? So in this case, if you want to allow public access, you have to explicitly make S3 bucket public. If you want to allow only authenticated requests, then you can lock it down to specific IAM roles and then access through IAM rules. So both options are possible. But either way, you need the CORS configuration.
Yeah.
All right, let's go through the last three questions now. And the security team requires that all data stored in cloud be encrypted at rest all times using encryption keys stored on premises. Which encryption options meet these requirements? Select two. C and D is the correct answer, but why is C and D?
So only in C and D, the keys that are used for encryption are managed by customer at its own. In C, it is stored on AWS but managed by customer. In D, it is managed and stored in customer premises. So that's how it will be controlled in on-premise. A and B both are AWS managed. That means there will be no control from customer side.
The requirement is that encryption keys are stored on premises. So that means customer is going to provide the encryption keys. So that rules out the first option because here, if you use S3 encryption, then S3 manages the key. So we don't even get to see the key. And if you pick SSE KMS, there also S3 uses KMS system and manages the key. We don't get to see the key. With this option, here, SSEC, here customer is providing the key, as the name implies, right? So every time customer is encrypting and decrypting, they have to specify the key to use, and only then the call will succeed. So every call to S3 will now include a key that is provided by the customer. And in the fourth option, customer is not even using S3 server-side encryption, rather they are encrypting directly in the client application and storing the encrypted object in S3. So here as well, the customer has complete control of the key and the encryption process. And then to decrypt, they have to download it back to the client and then decrypt at the client side. And then this one doesn't even make sense. So here we need to store encrypted at all times. So if you use this solution, it will go unencrypted and then Lambda will encrypt it behind the scenes. So there will be a time window where the object is unencrypted. Okay, any questions here?
Chandra, one comment actually. See, option B, right? Actually, customer manages on KMS, right?
Customer manages on KMS, but here the requirement is that the encryption keys are stored on premises. So in this scenario, within KMS, there is an option where you can import the key material but that is not discussed here. So you are allowed to import the key material from your own key generation system. So what they are saying is that you are blindly using KMS. In this case, S3 will automatically use KMS, and KMS will automatically manage the keys. We don't even get to see the key itself. So that
Okay,
means
got it. No, that is
so-
that is a key difference. Okay, because in the option C, you'll have to send the key in the request.
correct.
Now I get it. Okay.
So this is also once again discussed in the S3 section, encryption in the course, some of these concepts. So let me see where.
So in option B, even though the customer manages the key in KMS, they will not have access to the key. So that AWS internally manages. That's what you are saying, right? Just to confirm.
Correct.
Okay.
AWS internally manages. But within KMS, there is also one more option. You can create your own key, but import key material. So if they have provided that option, then that will also be a valid choice, where you can provide your key material and store it in KMS system. But that option is not specified here. I don't think at solutions architect associate level they'll ask that question. Security specialty, they will ask those kind of questions. But here, both these
Sure.
scenario keys are automatically managed, whereas here customer has complete control of the keys. All right, let's move on to the next one. So here, access log needs to be maintained for 5 years. Data is rarely accessed once stored, and must be accessible within 1 day notice if needed. What is the most cost-effective storage solution? Okay, somebody want to answer?
Typically, this is a completely infrequently accessed, 100%. It's more of archive. So it would be between Glacier and deep archive, Glacier. So typically we have to restore it, and then get access to the documents. But it takes if it is in terms of hours, we could have gone with Glacier. I don't see Glacier in this options also. So deep archive, it takes up to 48 hours, right, to restore and have access to the copy.
Yeah, by default, it provides 2 different options. So the standard options, I think it takes up to 12 hours. Since the customer says they can wait up to 1 day, so we have 24 hours to restore. So that means deep archive we can restore within 12 hours. And if you go for a bulk retrieval, that's when it takes up to 48 hours.
I missed that standard and bulk thing. So just that I remembered, Glacier, it's only up to hours actually, right? Am I correct? Or,
correct.
And yeah. Okay.
Sorry, your explanation is perfect actually. So your explanation was perfect. And so here we are talking about archival scenario, and either Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive will be good choices. Glacier is not even mentioned here because we want a most cost-effective storage solution. So the focus is on cost. You can also use standard storage and do all these things if you like, but you're paying 30 days of standard storage and then moving into Glacier, right? So that'll also technically work, but it'll be a more expensive solution. Infrequent access will also work, but it'll also be more expensive. Here, the lowest cost solution is going to be Deep Archive. And since they are giving us up to 12 or 24 hours, then we are okay. But if there is any time constraint, then we may want to go into Glacier or something else.
So one question is, within 12 hours, we can retrieve from Deep Archive, but how the more cost of retrieval of data is offset by the saving by putting it into Deep Archive?
So that is actually discussed in the S3 section of the course class.
Okay.
So the difference is that it's substantial, right? So for example, let me quickly show you the price difference. So for example, if you want to store 500 GB of data,
Okay.
It's going to cost only 50 cents in Deep Archive. Glacier will cost $2.
Yeah. Okay.
And then standard will cost $11.50. And retrieval will be next to nothing, retrieval charges. Okay, last question. Reserved instances are used to run data processing workload. The job takes 7 hours to run and must finish within 10-hour window. The company anticipates temporary increases in demand at the end of each month that will cause job to run over the time limit. with the capacity of current resources, right? So they're thinking that it may take more than 10 hours at the end of each month. Rest of the time, it's okay. However, so they're saying that once started, the processing job cannot be interrupted before completion. So they want to increase the capacity so that they can complete within that 10-hour window. So they're asking what is the best purchase option in this case to add capacity. Yeah, we'll discuss the answer in 10 seconds. I see only 3 responses so far. So throw in your answers if you have. All right, who wants to give it a shot?
So B cannot be because there is no long-term commitment for the new instance or additional instances. C cannot be because it's a critical application that needs to be complete. So spot instances cannot be. And increase the instance size on the run, it's not possible. So obviously the on-demand, maybe unwillingly because it may cost much, but yes, on-demand will be the best choice.
Okay, so let me clarify a few things. Your answer is almost correct, but so here there are some hints that once processing started, it cannot be interrupted, right? So the minute you see a keyword like this, cannot be interrupted, then we have to rule out spot because spot can be interrupted anytime, right?
And also DRA also, right? If you want to increase the instance size, you have to stop and.
If you want to increase the instance size, yes, you have to. That's a good point because you have to stop and restart.
That's
but you can do it before the job as well. So technically, this solution would work. So before the job starts, you can reconfigure it to use a bigger instance.
You cannot scale down, right? If you increase the size, but you cannot decrease it later.
They do allow, reservation does allow some flexibility in changing instance types. And if you increase it, then you can use it for multiple smaller instances in the same family. So for example, if you buy a 2x large, you can use it for two extra large or 4 large instances and so forth. They do allow that flexibility. So this solution would technically work, but then why do you want to change it? Because you are going to pay more money for the rest of the term, right? Whereas you need it only once a month. This particular situation is happening only once a month. So you need some additional capacity only during like that 10-hour window, 7 to 10-hour window. Right. So why do you want to pay for like 700 hours? Because every month has around 720, 750 hours. Why do you want to pay so much money when all you need is you're running the job only once a month? Or rather, there is a nightly job, but it's taking long time only once a month during end of the month, right? So so you need a short-term capacity, 10 hours every month, and for that on-demand makes perfect sense.
The interruption is the key there. Otherwise, you would have gone for spot. Right?
Absolutely. If the question says the application is fault tolerant, they don't care. Then spot might be a choice, and you can consider spot as well. Since it's saying that cannot be interrupted, we had to go with on-demand.
Okay, so Chandra, so the answer wise it's fine. So on the option D for the convertible reserved instances, so there is no interruption required, is it, for changing the size, etc.
You have to stop and start the instance.
That's a vertical.
That's right.
Yeah, scaling up, right? Okay. So you're increasing the size, so you have to stop and start.
So it's a vertical scaling, so you need to restart the instance if you pump up RAM or anything like that. Right?
Okay.
Correct.
Sure.
Correct.